All right, so welcome back, everybody, for another deep dive. Today, we're going to be looking at the recent Israeli airstrikes on Iranian military facilities. And, we've got a lot to unpack here. We've got reports coming out from everywhere, it seems like: Iran, Israel, the U.S., even statements from Pakistan, the UAE, Saudi Arabia, and even Hamas. And to make sure that we're dealing with facts on the ground here, we've got the BBC's verified footage of the aftermath. So this isn't just about explosions, though, right? This is about trying to understand what's motivating these strikes, the international fallout, and what this could mean for a region that's already pretty volatile.
Yeah, I mean, it's a bit like a chess game, isn't it? Every move has the potential to completely change the entire board, and I think we need to understand the strategy at play here.
Exactly. And speaking of seeing the board, that's where this BBC footage comes in. They've confirmed video showing a flash of light and explosion sounds in North Tehran. Plus, there's footage of smoke billowing from the Hazrat Amir Air Defense Base just south of the city. So these strikes are definitely real, and they're having a real impact.
It's definitely important to start with that visual confirmation. It really grounds the situation, It helps us move beyond speculation. Now, things get even more interesting when we look at the specific locations that were hit.
So let's break it down. We know that military facilities in Tehran were hit, along with sites in the western province of Elam and the southwestern province of Khuzestan. But here's where things get a little murky, right? Iran is claiming there was limited damage, and it's not really clear what that means in this context. But while an Israeli military spokesperson is talking about achieving broad air superiority in Iran.
Yeah, that discrepancy is pretty telling, don't you think? It raises some serious questions. Was this just a show of force by Israel? Or was the damage more significant than Iran is letting on? I mean, what does limited damage even mean when you're talking about, airstrikes on military facilities?
Yeah, it's not exactly like a fender bender, is it? I mean, are they trying to downplay the impact for, internal political reasons? Or are they genuinely trying to de-escalate the situation by minimizing the damage?
Yeah, it's definitely possible they're trying to control the narrative, both domestically and internationally. But to understand their motives, we need to consider what Israel is saying about their targets. They claim to have hit missile production sites, surface-to-air missile sites, and air defense locations.
And they even went so far as to urge Iran, through a third party, to not retaliate. Now, that really makes you think, doesn't it? Is this genuine? Are they really trying to prevent further escalation? Or is there something else going on here?
It's a move that's worth looking into for sure. What I find really interesting, though, is what they didn't target: Iranian oil and nuclear facilities. That seems like a deliberate choice, and I think it sends a pretty clear message.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. It's like they're saying, we're going to hit you where it hurts.
Yeah.
But we're not crossing that line.
But what does that line mean for Iran? How are they responding to all of this? Well, initially they closed their airspace, but it was reopened pretty soon after. Sadly, 2 Iranian military personnel, Major Jahandia and Warrant Officer Shirokfar, were killed in the strikes. And of course, Iran is claiming to have successfully countered some of the attacks.
Yeah, and that could mean anything, right? From shooting down a few missiles to surviving the initial wave. So,
Yeah.
We have to be careful about taking these statements at face value.
Oh, for sure. It's important to think about, who's saying it and why they might be saying it. But what's undeniable is the Iranian Foreign Ministry's condemnation of these attacks. They're calling it a violation of international law, and they're asserting their right to defend themselves.
Which leaves us all wondering, how are they going to do that? I mean, what options are realistically on the table for them?
Well, that's the big question, isn't it? And I think to really understand what might happen next, we need to kind of zoom out a little bit and look at how the rest of the world is reacting.
Yeah, it does feel like everyone is kind of holding their breath, waiting to see what happens next. So what's the global temperature on all of this?
Well, it's a bit of a mixed bag, really, which I think kind of reflects how complex the geopolitical landscape is. You've got the U.S. urging Iran not to retaliate, and, they're emphasizing the potential consequences if they do. Then you've got Pakistan and the UAE condemning the attacks and calling for restraint.
And then there's Saudi Arabia denouncing the violation of Iran's sovereignty. It's kind of interesting given their history.
Yeah, it's a good reminder that alliances in the Middle East can be pretty fluid and driven as much by pragmatism as they are by ideology. And speaking of unexpected reactions, we can't forget about Hamas's condemnation of the attacks. They're calling it an infringement on Iranian sovereignty and regional security.
So it seems like even those who aren't directly involved in the Israeli-Palestinian conflict are feeling the ripple effects of these strikes. I mean, does this point towards a potential widening of the conflict, or are we seeing a collective desire for de-escalation?
That's the key question, I think. And to really get a handle on where this might be headed, we need to look back a little. Remember, this isn't the first time Israel has targeted Iranian military facilities.
Right, you're talking about the incident near Isfahan back in April, where an Israeli strike took out Iranian air defenses.
Exactly. And what's really fascinating is that Iran initially denied that attack, but a former commander of the Revolutionary Guards later admitted that it did happen. So we're seeing a pattern here, wouldn't you say? A kind of tit-for-tat exchange that's been simmering for years.
Yeah, it's a dangerous game, and it feels like the stakes just got a lot higher.
Yeah.
But before we try to predict the future, maybe we should take a step back and recap what we know for sure.
Good idea. Let's bring it all together. We have visual confirmation of the strikes from the BBC. We have a list of target locations. And we have conflicting narratives about the extent of the damage. And of course, we see a complex web of international reactions, some urging restraint, others condemning the violation of Iranian sovereignty.
But this isn't happening in a vacuum, is it? It feels like there are other forces at play here, a bigger picture that we need to be thinking about.
Absolutely. We can't ignore the ongoing situation in Gaza, which adds another layer of complexity to the whole geopolitical landscape. Remember, our goal here isn't just to understand what happened, it's to figure out what it all means for you, for the region, for the world.
So what does this all mean for our listeners? Why should they care about these events that are unfolding thousands of miles away?
Because what happens in the Middle East rarely stays in the Middle East. These events have the potential to impact energy prices, international relations, even the threat of terrorism. We're talking about consequences that could be felt right here at home.
That's a really important point. The world is interconnected whether we like it or not. But let's maybe zoom back in on the immediate situation. What's the biggest question looming over all of this right now?
I think it boils down to this: will Iran retaliate? And if so, how? They have a history of responding to Israeli aggression. After that incident near Isfahan, remember, they launched a barrage of ballistic missiles.
So is this the tipping point? Are we on the brink of a full-blown conflict?
It's certainly a possibility, but we also have to remember that Iran might choose a different path. They could choose to de-escalate, fearing, further retaliation from Israel or increased international pressure. It all comes down to how they weigh the risks and benefits.
That's a good point. It reminds us that there are always multiple perspectives to consider. It's easy to assume they'll just lash out, but maybe a more calculated response, or even a deliberate lack of response, might be more in their strategic interest.
Right. On the one hand, they need to project strength both domestically and internationally to deter future attacks. On the other hand, provoking a wider conflict could have devastating consequences, not just for the region, but potentially for their own regime.
So what factors will influence their decision? What's happening behind the scenes that might push them one way or the other?
Well, I think the first thing to consider is the extent of the damage from these airstrikes. If it's more significant than they're letting on, they might feel like they have to respond forcefully just to, save face.
Yeah, it's all about perception, isn't it? They need to be seen as strong and capable of defending themselves, especially given all the internal pressure they're facing right now.
Exactly. And that brings us to the second factor: international support. If they've got countries like Russia and China, offering them backing, that might embolden them to take a more aggressive stance. But if they're feeling isolated on the world stage, they might be more cautious.
So it's like they're playing this high-stakes poker game trying to figure out, who's bluffing and who's holding the winning hand.
Yeah, and we can't forget about that wild card, their domestic political situation. They're facing protests and unrest, so they might feel like they need to project strength and resolve, even if that means taking a riskier path.
So many things to consider. It feels like there's so much potential for miscalculation at every turn. So let's try to game this out a bit. What would retaliation even look like? What are some potential scenarios we should be watching for?
Well, a direct military response is definitely possible, right? Think ballistic missiles targeting Israeli military bases or infrastructure. They could also use their network of proxy groups in the region, like Hezbollah in Lebanon or Shia militias in Iraq, to launch attacks on Israeli interests.
So instead of a head-on collision, we could see a series of smaller skirmishes, a sort of shadow war playing out across the region.
Exactly. It's a way for them to inflict pain without necessarily triggering a full-blown conflict. And then there's the cyber realm to consider. Iran has shown what they can do in cyberspace before, and a major cyber attack on Israeli infrastructure could cause real disruption.
It's a scary thought when you think about how interconnected everything is these days. A conflict that starts with bombs could easily spill over into the digital world with consequences we can't even imagine.
And that brings us back to the question of de-escalation. What would that look like? Would it involve back-channel diplomacy, international condemnation of Israel, maybe even a prisoner exchange?
I mean, is that even possible at this point? It
hmm
feels like things are so tense right now. Any wrong move could set off a chain reaction.
De-escalation is always a possibility, but it takes, careful planning and a willingness to compromise from both sides.
Mm.
It might involve Iran using their influence in the region, putting pressure on Israel through third parties, or maybe engaging in some quiet negotiations to try and reach some kind of understanding.
So instead of a loud, dramatic response, we might see something more subtle and strategic. It's a reminder that sometimes the most effective actions are the ones that happen behind closed doors.
And that silence, that lack of immediate retaliation, can be just as powerful as any missile launch. It can be a way of signaling strength and restraint and a long-term strategy that goes beyond just, immediate gratification.
It's really a fascinating and kind of terrifying game of chess, isn't it?
hmm
So as we wrap up this deep dive, what should our listeners be paying attention to in the coming days and weeks? What are the key indicators that will tell us which direction this is heading?
Well, I think the most important thing is to watch Iran's actions, not just their words. Look for any signs of military mobilization, increased activity by their proxy groups or, cyber attacks targeting Israel. But also pay attention to their diplomatic efforts. Are they reaching out to international partners trying to build support for their position, or are they isolating themselves further?
Yeah, it's all about reading between the lines, isn't it? Trying to figure out what the signals are amidst all the noise.
Exactly. And don't forget about the international response, too. Are countries lining up behind Israel condemning Iran? Or are they pushing for dialogue and de-escalation? The global reaction will have a big impact on how this conflict unfolds.
That's a good point. It reminds us that we're not just spectators in all of this. What happens in the Middle East, even something as seemingly distant as an airstrike, can have ripple effects that touch all of our lives.
And that's why it's so important to stay informed and engage in critical thinking and consider multiple perspectives. The world is a complex place, and understanding those complexities is really the first step towards navigating them effectively.
Couldn't have said it better myself. Well, this has been a really insightful deep dive. I think we've all learned a lot about the forces at play here, the potential consequences, and the difficult choices facing everyone involved.
It's definitely a situation that deserves our attention, our careful analysis, and maybe most importantly, our empathy.
Well said. So we'll leave you all to think about the implications of these events and the potential scenarios that might unfold. Thanks for joining us for this deep dive into a situation that is definitely not over.